There are too many information places. Hello, everyone. This is Toronto Perl Mongers March meeting. We have with us Zoffix Znet or Znet.
I never pronounce it.
Oh, you never say it out loud. I always just think of you as Zoffix.
Sure.
Who will be giving us a presentation on WoW Perl 6. Let me just set up the screen share. Entire screen. Lock that onto you. Share. There we go. There we go. It should be off and running, and I need to make that a little bigger.
How do you make it full screen?
Oh, someone's banging. Should be able to just do Command F. Just Command Option, Shift F. No, I can never remember. There we go. There we go.
All right, thanks. Should I start?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. My name is Pete, and online you can find me as Zoffix. Sorry, I'm late. I got lost in this building for like 20 minutes. Wow. And today I will talk about Perl 6 and especially features that I think really amazing. If anyone at any time has any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and ask them. You can also get the slides at tpm2016.zoffix.com. And in this presentation, I will also be using fancy Unicode characters that Perl 6 lets you use. If you don't like to use them, all of them have regular alternatives. And on that, you can go on that link and find those characters if you want to use those. Yeah.
I've never heard this phrase, Texas variants. What's that?
I don't know. That's just the name.
Smith and Wesson beats 4 aces.
It's everything bigger in Texas, right? Some of
Oh yeah, probably that's why.
Texas, they feel no foreign stuff.
And especially if you don't understand some of the syntax, just go ahead and ask, because I on purpose used all kinds of shortcuts that I will use in normal code just to show them to you. So first we'll talk about lazy lists. I know, can everybody see that? Do you know how to make it bigger?
Command plus.
So the first thing you can notice in Perl 6, you can use hyphens as part of the variable names. And that makes it much easier to type code. Also on the first line, I'm creating an infinite list. And I'm using a sequence operator to do that. And the way it works is I specify the first element, which is 0. Then I specify a second element, which is twice as big, like two digits forward. And the sequence operator can actually figure out that I want the next element to increase by 2. So I get all, in this infinite sequence, I get all even numbers until infinity. Now, this doesn't crash your computer, even though it is an infinite list. That's because it's a lazy list. And when on line number 2, when I access element 1008, it generates only enough elements to fulfill that request and no more. And practical application of that is reading in a large file. So in this loop, I'm reading a 4 GB file, but all I want is to get the first 3 words. So the way I'm doing it is I specify the file name. I use IO method to get the file handle. And then I call words method that gives me a lazy list of words. And then I just use a for loop to iterate over them. On line number 2, I just print the word that I found. And on line number 3, I'm just using a counter to print only the first 3 words. And if you look at that counter variable, you will notice it doesn't have a name. That's actually an anonymous variable that you can use as a counter in a loop. And on line number 5, I'm just printing out how long it took the program to run. I'm using an init. It's called a phaser. It's basically similar to a begin block in Perl 5. The code inside the block runs only right away after the program starts. And basically this way you can see how long it took your program to run. So you can see it took only a fraction of a second to run this program, even though it's a large file. And so basically it read only as much as it was needed. And there's actually a simpler way to write this. You can just use a slice. So it all becomes one line of code that runs really fast. So in this section, I'm going to talk about subsets, custom operators, and multiple dispatch.
What's the Texas equivalent of the infinity symbol?
It would be word inf, INF. Yeah. So a subset lets you restrict a type to make it more narrow. So on the first line, I want to have an int type that's only integers, but I also want it to be larger than 10,000. And also I want it to be a prime number. So on line 1, I'm declaring a subset called big prime, and I'm using the where keyword to specify the restrictions. And then on line number 3, I just have a subroutine. I'm using that subset to specify the type of the variable. And then if you look below, actually, this is the main sub. You'll notice it is called main. And it actually basically, it lets you take arguments from the command line. And it also provides some basic usage instructions, like you can see on the screen. I've ran it with some numbers. Whenever it didn't match the number that I gave it, when it didn't match the subset, it just gave me usage instructions. Yeah.
Okay. So if you were creating a big prime, is there any way to test the sitting the big prime before you actually do like throws exception or dies or something, right? If you try to assign, is there a way of just testing that using this where condition, or you just have to attempt it?
Test if it dies?
Well, I guess you could just catch.
Oh,
like let's say I have a number and I want to create a big prime. I don't know if it's big prime or not. How would can I use a where condition to do a test as well? To say that big prime doesn't match the condition.
I'm not sure.
I think you can. Maybe not in the sub main, but you can have a smaller sub that takes in a big prime. If nothing else, and then just send that. Also,
because I mean it's just a boolean, like just
yeah.
So you think there'd be a way of invoking that as a function on any input, and then just having it return the true false.
Oh, are you asking if you can use the block in the where?
The where, like you just use the where. I don't know, just like if I just
the where is a block of code. Basically, you can do anything you want there.
No, I know, but just reusing it so that I can just say big prime dot, and then I don't know where, and then I pass it my candidate, and it would say whether it's true or false. It passes the condition.
Yeah, you can call some code if you want. I don't know if it answers your question.
Is there a way to check for membership in that subset?
Yeah, so it has an exit element, like refactor or having extra code.
Oh, okay.
I feel like there is. I'm not sure about that though.
Well, I'm not sure.
I mean, like it is a.
Like it is. Does it match? Like like the subset type, would it have like a member that you can call?
I'm not sure. There might be.
I suspect.
I think there's a method. It's called candidates. I think you can check that way, but I'm not sure. Sorry.
Main's a bit confusing too, because if you have that in the code, you can't put it. I ran across this. I was trying to use it to get some parameters from the command line, and discovered that it enforced the order in which code ran. I can't remember exactly where around it was now, but essentially the only way to control the order of things was to put them into the main subroutine itself, which you couldn't sort of call it from somewhere else.
Is there a way of having a more meaningful error message or something that is match condition?
I don't think so, because basically it tries to compile it, and I think actually for subs message it would. I don't know, actually no. It might say for subs. I think it says expected big prime, but I didn't get it. But for methods, it's just gonna say it doesn't match. It doesn't even tell you the name of the subset. So
Well, here you don't even say finding that it's
right,
not a valid number. It's just like, you're supposed to give me a number,
yeah.
and you did.
In this example, I'm kind of rectified here. But if it were just a regular sub that you're trying to call, you can catch that exception when it fails to call with a number, and then maybe display the message.
So, quick question going back to the previous
I
slide.
feel
again.
like messages of program parameters is a relevant
Yeah.
So it's giving you a user's message saying test.p6, and it takes in a num, right?
Right.
Is it getting that num from the variable name?
Yeah.
Or okay, so it's not just problematic saying it's an int.
No, it's a
Okay.
variable name. Yeah. So in this more better example, I guess. First of all, I'm creating 3 subsets, and on line number 2 and 3, I'm actually creating a subset of a subset, so you can nest them this way. You can also notice the where clause. I'm using an asterisk instead of a code block. That's called a whatever star, and I'm going to talk about it later. But for now, you can see that it lets you get rid of the block and also get rid of the $_ variable. And now I'm using multiple main subroutines, and I changed the sub keyword to multi. So that's called multi-dispatch. Basically, you use one subroutine with the same name. Multiple subroutines with one name, and they all differ on signatures. And when the compiler tries to figure out which subroutine to call, it goes by the signature. So if you look at the usage message, depending on which number you specify, the different multi gets called. And on line number 7, we don't specify the type, so that's like the widest type that it can match. And I guess this is the place where you might specify a better usage message. And also there are some modules in the ecosystem that you might find handle options better, like command line options. Here,
What would happen if you called the program with no arguments?
you will get the bad user message, I think. I'm not sure.
The third one is not going to match.
Yeah, it's not gonna match.
It's matching
You're
one
right.
argument of anything that doesn't so far.
There is a special sub cap usage to modify the usage message according to the program.
Cool. You can also have multi-dispatch on methods. Here's one example. I have a class with a method called ID. It's a multi-method, and one of the signatures looks for a numeric type, and the other signature matches any type. And when I call it with a pi, with number pi, and yes, you can use actual letter, it gets called, the numeric subroutine gets called, method gets called, and otherwise the other one. Yep.
Is there a reason why you have to explicitly say that it's multi and it doesn't detect if you make multiple definitions? Is that like an optimization?
The reason is error detection, I guess. If you don't want a multi and you name 2 methods the same thing.
Well, currently with the last one wins you. So is it actually going to does it actually die if you have 2 subs with the same name?
Without multi, yeah, it will show you a compile time error. And even with multi, if there are two signatures that it can't figure out which one to call, like ambiguous signatures, it will give you a compile time error.
Compile time?
Yeah.
Not even runtime.
No, compile.
Kind of surprised.
Well, I guess maybe there's a case where it can't figure out at compile time and then at runtime. Yeah, so this is one class, right? And what if you want to extend that, what the ID method does without touching that class? You can subclass it, and that's what we're doing on line number 6. We're creating a class smarter numbers, and we're writing is numbers. That's a subclassing the previous class. And we're defining a method ID. And in the signature, you can actually specify where clause without explicitly declaring a subset. And we only wanted to match number pi. And from the output, you can see that it actually, depending on which number you specify, different multi gets called. And basically, we extended what method ID does without ever touching the original class. Custom terms and operators. Now, I haven't tried doing this, but this can be a Perl 6 program.
Oh God, we'll never hear the end of it.
So we're going to declare one custom operator. And an operator is basically a subroutine. And the only real difference is you prefix it with a category. You can have infix, prefix, postfix, circumfix, and post-circumfix operators. On this one, we're doing an infix operator, and we put the name of it inside of angular brackets. You can use any character you want for it. The only restriction is you can't use white space. So you can go pretty crazy with those if you really want.
This is going to bring Perl golfing to a whole new level.
And on line number 5, we are using that operator. It randomly picks between Coke and Pepsi. And another thing you can see, normally you would use a signature, but if it's a really small sub and you put a signature and you use those variables right away, it kind of feels like a repetition. So instead, what you can do is you can use a twigel. That's a sigil with 2 characters. In this case, the twigel is the $ and caret. And A represents the first argument. I mean the first argument, and B the second one, and you can go A, B, C, D, and so forth. And that kind of lets you create a signature without actually creating a signature. Let's pick
Random choice.
Yeah, pick. It will pick at random from that list. Here we're going to create something more useful. It's that character is an n-ary sum, and what it does in math is it sums up all those given arguments. So same thing, we just create it as a regular sub. We use prefix as a category. For the signature, we're using an array, and you see I put a star there. What it means is that it should slurp all available arguments into that array. And in the body, I'm just using the sum method to sum up. But if you look at the output, it doesn't look right. What's actually happening is the precedence of our operator is higher than the precedence of the comma operator. So the only thing our prefix operator gets is the first element, and it returns it, and then the rest of the numbers go to say. That's why it's wrong. So you can change the precedence with is looser trait, and you basically give it as a parameter. You give it the operator that you want to. Basically, our prefix operator is slightly looser precedence than the infix comma operator. The default precedence it gets is the same as the plus operator in that position. So in this case, it would be like a unary plus. And from the result, you can see that now that we made it looser than a comma, the result is correct. You can also change associativity of an operator, and you can check the documentation on how to do that. This is just a more elaborate example with post circumflex that uses 2 characters to create the operator. And on line number 2, when we specify the name of it, you would just use white space to separate the left part from the right part. You can still use whatever character sequence you want. On line number 7, we are using that operator to look up a hash value. And the key is inside the operator, and the hash itself is before the operator. And you can see on line number 2 in the signature, you get those pieces as 2 arguments. And on line number 3, we just look them up. And on line number 2, we're using RW trait at the end. That specifies that we can, whatever tries to write to this value, it can. And that's why on line number 7, we can add, assign a value to it. And on line number 1, we are using the term category. Essentially, it's basically a regular sub, except you can use whatever weird character you want, sequence of characters. And for this one, actually, I didn't have to use it because that's actually a letter of the Greek alphabet. And Perl 6 lets you use any proper language, any proper letter to name your subroutines and variables. So if you want to program in Chinese, you can. And the other thing on line number 1, you can see caret 10, that's a range operator. It creates a sequence of numbers from 0 to 10. And I'm also adding 1 to it. And in Perl,
0 to 10 or 0?
Oh, 0 to 9.
Ah.
And I'm adding 1 to it. And basically, the way this plus operator is defined, if it sees a range object on the left and the integer on the right, it increases every element in that range by 1. So what that means is the plus sign is actually a bunch of multi-subroutines that work differently depending on what type of object you provide to the plus. And you can actually completely change how the default operators work. In this example, we're changing the plus on 2 ints into a minus. So when you say 2 plus 2, you actually get a 0.
Dear sweet God.
So this sounds like a...
Can you prevent someone from changing an operator?
That's a good question. It actually works only lexically. So it only affects the parts of code that can actually reach that subnet, call that subroutine. So another thing to say here is because we're not using a multi, and we only define it for two int objects, we actually shadow all the other multis, and this example with a range object on the left and int on the right is not going to work anymore. It's going to show you an error. So a more useful way to do this is to define a multi on your operator. And in Perl 5, usually you would use a module called overload to kind of define the way standard operators work with your objects. In Perl 6, the way you do it is you just define your own operators, and in the signature, you use your object as a type. And so here we create one object, and we create one multi-concatenation operator with our object as the first argument and string on the second argument. And you can see it works. The standard operator works fine on line number 8. On 9, our object and string work as we want it to. But on line number 10, we get some weird text, right? So the reason for that is because it doesn't match the signature of our operator that we created, and it actually uses the default Perl operator that stringifies the object. So if you ever try to make your object behave like something people would use instead of a string or instead of a number, you actually have to define like 3 different operators with all the combinations. And that might result in some code repetition. You can look at that module color operators to see some example of how to avoid that. You kind of basically just create a new subroutine that kind of figures out whether the argument is an object or just a regular internal type. Now we're going to talk about multi-core processing. And there's a bunch of features that offer a hint to a compiler to use multiple threads to perform that operation. Now, currently, the compiler will never take that hint. It's not yet implemented. But those features are still useful, so I'm going to talk about them. If you Google for hyperoperators in Perl 6, you will find a bunch that kind of look like those. I'm not going to talk about them. You can find them online or click on that link. But the version that I will talk about is this one, and the one where you prefix a method call with an operator. And this one, soon enough, it will actually multi-thread when you invoke it, if it makes sense. So imagine you have an array with 9 elements. You want to uppercase each one of them, and you want to break it up into subsets of 3. In this case, I'm using map, and inside of that map, I'm using the UC method, that's uppercase, and then I'm just using a rotor to break it up into 3. Now that looks pretty simple, but what if you have tons of elements, or the method you're calling is really time-consuming? You can use this hyperoperator before the method call. And what it tells Perl is not to call it on the array itself, but on the elements of that array. Or it could be a list or a sequence. It works there as well. And you can see we can still continue that chain and call rotor after the hypercall. So that really simplifies the code. That's why you probably would use it right now. And compiler might optimize too. But eventually, it will be a hint to use multiple threads. So one day, you will wake up and find your code runs faster.
What was the before syntax? You have a map operation? I can't see
Yeah.
that. Okay.
So basically, I replaced the map with a hyperoperator.
So I assume there's an infinite number of threads then.
It will
Behind the scenes, what?
it will figure out the
Yeah.
best way to do it. Basically, yeah. The idea is that you don't have to think how many threads you need. Now, if instead of one method you want to do a bunch of things, and you can use a hyper sequence to do so, and you get one of those on calling either hyper method or race method on one of the sequences, like an array or a list. And currently, hyper is really buggy. And people told me not to mention it.
Yeah.
But I just pointing it out. And the only difference between hyper and race is that hyper preserves the final order of elements in that sequence. I'm not sure where it's useful. I tried to play around with it, but it was buggy. So for now, just use race. And the way to use it is here you can see I have a 4-element sequence, numbers 1 through 4. I call a race method, and then I'm just using the for loop to iterate over it. Inside of that for loop, I print out the value, and I sleep for 1 second. If you look at the output, you can see the numbers are not in the sequence, not in the original sequence, which suggests they were executed on different threads. And also, if you look at the runtime, it took only 1 second to run, even though we slept for 4 seconds. So that code, it was run concurrently. And you can see on the race method, I'm giving a parameter batch. You can use this to control how many elements of that sequence it does in a single batch. So say you have tons of elements, and the code you run is really fast. Then you want to increase the batch. or in this case, I have only a few items, but they take forever to run, then I decrease the batch to 1, and default is 64. Yeah, again, hyper is the same as raise, except it preserves the order. Out-of-threaded junctions. So a junction is a logical superposition of values. Here we have just a regular code with some logical checks. We have an array with some valid values. We got something from the user, and we want to check if that something is actually valid. And then on line number 4, we just check it against a couple of values. So instead of this code, you can use junctions that look like this. So on line number 3, we change that grep into a non-junction, and the code reads better. It says if whatever user gave us equals none of the valid values, then trigger the message. And on line number 4, I'm using an operator form of the any junction. So it's less of repetition to write it. So it checks against 2 values. And the available junctions you have are all, any, one, or none. You can make them with a constructor, which is that, all, any, one, or none. Or for the first 3, you can use an operator between your values to create a junction, like we did all. Oops. Something happened.
Oops.
I think I pressed something here.
No, that's all you, man.
Is it the end of the presentation?
There you go.
Yeah, so here we used a pipe character that's an operator for an any junction. And the best part, even though it's not going to work right now, but it's a hint to use multiple threads to make the evaluation when that makes sense. Perl 6 also has promises. In some languages, they're called futures. So on line number 1, I'm starting a concurrent piece of code using the start keyword. Inside of it, I'm going to sleep for 3 seconds and print out word 2. On line number 2, I'm printing out 1, sleeping for 5 seconds, and then printing out 3. But if you look at the output, actually 1, 2, 3 is in order. So what actually happened is after it launched that start block, it went ahead right away, printed 1, then slept for 5 seconds. During that time, the other thread printed out the 2, and then after 5 seconds, it printed 3. So that's really easy to write concurrent code with just that. Here's a more elaborate example. In this code, I actually waited for 5 seconds because I knew it will complete in 3 seconds. But if you don't know when it's going to complete, you can use this. On line number 8, I'm using await keyword to await a bunch of promises that I create in a previous block. I'm just using a map to loop over 3 numbers, and for each one of them, I'm starting the promise. I'm sleeping for 1 second, and I'm as the last line on line number 4. I'm using that value from the map, so from 0 to 2, and I'm multiplying it by 4. So that value, because it's the last one in that block, it will actually be returned on line number 8 to await keyword. So this way you can concurrently perform an operation and return some sort of result from it. And from the output, you can see all 3 promises completed in just 1 second, even though they slept for 1 second each. If you want your promise to start later, you can use the in method that takes a number of seconds that it has to wait. In this case, we're actually using the promise promise type itself instead of special keywords. And then the in method returns a new promise, and I'm calling then method on it. It takes a block that we want to run. And from the output, you can see it waited for 5 seconds, then ran that block that we gave to the promise, and after 7 seconds, it printed the second message.
Can you kill a promise?
I believe so. There are some methods, like you can check if it's still running using the status keyword. I know you can call break method, I think it's called. But
Breaking a promise.
yeah. Yeah. Perl 6 also has supplies. That's asynchronous data streaming. It's essentially similar to an event loop. Here on line number 1, we're creating a supplier. And on line number 7, we're emitting a bunch of values from it into it from 0 to 2. And we create 3 tabs on that supply. On line number 3, we just printing out whatever value we got. But now on line number 4, you can see you can actually use a map on whatever you get from your supply to kind of change the value before you tap into it. And you can use grep as well. That's what we do on line number 5. And even though each block basically is just a say statement that prints out the value, from the output you can see that those values were either filtered or modified. Here is a way to write an event loop. You just use a React block, and inside of that React, you can use whenever keyword that will watch for a supply. And here we have 2 supplies. We just use interval method. It creates integers, incrementing integers in the first case, it's every 2 seconds. On line number 6, we use every 1 second. That's the parameter. That's what the parameter does. And on the second supply, we just print the value. And on the first one, we print it. But also on line number 4, you can notice that we check the value that we got. And when it reaches 2, we call the done keyword. So what it does when you call it, it will exit the React block. So that's how you can exit your event loop. Perl 6 also has channels, which is a thread safe queue. Now, if you look at the output, you can see every second we generate a value. And if you look at how we do it, we create a channel. Then on line number 2, we start a loop, a loop and a promise that calls a receive method on that channel. It's blocking. It will block until you get a value. If you want it non-blocking, you can use poll method. But in this case, it will wait for the value, then print it. And if you call it on a closed channel, it will generate an exception. And that's how, in this case, how we break out from that loop. And now on line number 5, we're creating 10 promises that will sleep for an increasing number of seconds and then send a number to that channel. So in effect, even though the output generates a value every second, what's actually happening is we have 10 threads that are communicating to a 11th thread. And basically you can pass values between different threads. Grammars, you use them to parse stuff. Now, the examples I have here look like an overkill. That's because they are. Usually you would use a grammar to parse some, say, JSON or HTML, something bigger than this. So on line number 8, giving a string, a number, to the parse method, and I'm printing out the result. The result I get is the match object. And from the output, you can see it printed out what matched, and it printed out a bunch of tokens. And the way you define those tokens is from the grammar itself. The top token is the first token when you start to parse. That's kind of the start of it. Inside of it, I'm using one sign token, digits token, and an optional decimal token. And that's using a regex, Perl 6 regex. The syntax is a bit different from Perl 5, but it's just a regex. And you define a bunch of tokens, so you can use tokens inside of other tokens. And in it, basically, you kind of create a tree of how your things should should parse, and you get it out from the match object after you parse. Now, usually you don't just want to look at what you parse, you want to do something with it. So this is where the actions class comes in. For each token that you have in your grammar, you can define a method. It takes a match object as a signature. You can call a make method to store a value that this token kind of should represent. And you can get that value back inside other tokens by calling made method. So here, for the sign token, we just check if the sign has any characters. If it doesn't, we just change it to plus. And if it does, we just keep it as it is. That's on line number 9. And on line number 10, that's the final token. We just make it the sign, the made. I'm calling the made method to get the value that we stored. And then I'm adding digits token, but I'm incrementing it by 42. And then I'm connecting the decimal token. And in the output, you can see now our number has a plus sign and it got incremented. So using this action class, you can create a whole bunch of actions on your grammar. Now, there's a lot more that can be done with grammars, and I'm told this is one of the kind of the best features of Perl 6. And actually, Perl 6 itself gets parsed with a Perl 6 grammar. And if you look at it, it's much more advanced than this stuff. Here are a bunch of modules you can find useful, especially grammar tracer. If you just use it in your code, when your grammar runs, it will tell you what's being matched and when. This way you can see if it's working correctly. And also BNF, that's a format for kind of definition of some stuff you might be parsing. So if you get your hands on a BNF grammar, you can just use that module to convert it to Perl 6 grammar, so you don't have to even write any code.
So you could use probably produce an interpreted C using Perl 6. The BNF on the C is fairly straightforward, I think.
Yeah.
That's evil.
Here's a bunch of random stuff.
There's BNF for Python, isn't it?
Whatever star, we saw it before, it basically lets you very easily create a closure. The 3 examples at the top do the same thing as the 3 examples at the bottom, and you can see some differences between them. Basically, a whatever star represents an argument. So in the first example, it will be changed to the argument number to the number 2. On line number 2, we're using it instead of the topical variable, instead of the $_, and it lets you avoid the block. Then we already seen how we can use it in the subset to again get rid of the block. And if you use more than one, it will actually represent a second and third argument. So, like in this example, it's summing up all those 3 arguments. And of course, this means you can't use the same star kind of, you can't say call a method on one argument more than once. You have to kind of convert it to a block, because the second star that you use will represent the second argument instead of the first one.
What do you do if you want to multiply?
You can use Unicode. You can use Unicode symbol for multiplication to make it easier to read. Or
Really?
Yeah. Or you can just use the star. This could be 5 stars.
Oh God!
You can't reuse, let's say, the first argument. But if you only have one argument, then if you only had one argument.
And you use 2 stars, it will say, where's the second argument?
Okay.
Yeah.
But here the caret notation would be more meaningful, right? Would you A, B, and C?
Yeah. Like, yeah, in this example.
Yeah.
You want to use an argument.
Well, I think actually,
Caret notation.
yeah, the only thing you would have to use a block instead of just.
Caret notation demands a block.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, most of the useful thing about this, it lets you avoid those curlies. The block.
So how will this behave if I have 4 options passed in here, how does the final start behave?
If you have 4,
If I pass in 4 options, is it
it will say
That's an error.
you gave me 4, but I need only 3.
okay? So it's,
It
you're
basically
not
creates a
looking
signature.
for-
Yeah, it
okay.
creates a signature that expects 3 arguments of any type.
Okay.
Now you can also, and it's not specific to whatever code. You can also use those $caret inside the block, and if you use more than one in things like map or grab, it will actually use more than one item at a time. So here we're mapping over 12 items, but our output is only 4 items because we use 3 arguments at a time. Here's a one-liner to create a Fibonacci sequence. We're using a sequence operator. And for the 3rd element, we're using 2 whatever stars, and the way it interprets it. The first argument is the previous element, and the second argument would be the element before that, and so forth. In this case, we are just summing up 2 previous arguments. And on the right side, I'm also of the sequence operator. I'm also using the whatever star. In this case, it will just go to infinity, but you can use it to limit how far it goes. So if you want your sequence to stop at before 1000, you use the star less than 1000. There's also a hyper whatever. I'm not sure what it's useful for. You can barely find the documentation for it. The only way you can find it, kind of discover it, if you try multiply the whatever star by something and you forget to put the space, you will get an error. So you can see just the difference between them. It looks like the hyper whatever. It takes its argument as a list and it returns a list, while the normal whatever it returned as a range object. The same thing that we passed it. Perl 6 also has a whole bunch of meta operators, and I'm going to mention a couple. So the first form, you just put a normal operator inside of a square bracket, and it works as if you use that operator between each element in the list. So the first line is the same as if you put plus between 1, 2, and 3. Second is the same as if you put multiplication between each item. And on line number 5, you can see the less than operator. And in this case, it returns false because 4 is not less than 3. So you can experiment with that. Another form is you prefix it with a backslash, and that's a triangle reduce. So instead of simply placing the operator between the elements, you do operation between the first element and the second, then you take that result and apply that operator between that result and the next element, and you kind of continue like that, reducing your result. And there's a whole bunch of variants, and obviously you can use any operator, so there are many options. This is just something to keep in mind. I guess if you're used to a different language, when you're trying to do something, you're not going to think, oh, you know what, I can use the meta operator. But once you get used to them, you will find more ways to use them. Perl 6 object model. I'm no expert, but people said Perl 6 has one of the most advanced object models among modern languages. So I'm going to show some of it. Here's how you could create a class. Line number 2, you just define an attribute. You use the $.twidgel, and that will be public, but it will be read only. If you want the user to write to it, you would use the isRw trait. That's line number 3. You can also specify a required attribute. Those will be required when you construct an object. And you can assign default values. That's on line number 5. And you can have private attributes using the exclamation point for the private attributes. Now the $sign and dot that creates a public attribute, It's actually just a shortcut to create a private attribute and create a method for it. So on line number 7, you can see, even though I created public methods using $ and dot, I'm still inside of the class. I'm still accessing them with a $ exclamation point. You could use $ and dot, but that would actually call the method. So you don't need to call the method. You can just access them directly. And if you want the private method, just prefix it with an exclamation point. You can also specify types of your attributes. You can use subsets. You would use them like this. Now, Perl 6 also has roles. They are similar to classes, except there's a difference for how they get applied to classes. So here we have a role that provides method draw. On line number 4, we have compose it into class line, and then you can see on line number 9 we can call method draw and it will do something. And roles usually add behavior to your classes, while you would use a subclass to actually kind of change your original class. And here's an example of where roles differ from classes. We have a second role that also provides method draw, and we compose both of them into our class. And if they were classes, you would get one of those methods, depending on how it gets resolved. But with roles, you actually get the compile time error saying you can't compose those you have because they conflict between each other. And this way you can detect if there's some kind of conflict when you try to compose multiple roles. Perl 6 also has a meta object protocol. It lets you inspect your objects and learn more about them. This is what you get by default, a whole bunch of methods. The most useful of those is probably the what method. It tells you the name of the object. And especially when you're learning the language, if you get something and you don't know which methods you can call on that, just print out its what value. You will learn what object it is, and then you can look up the documentation and see what you can call on it. The other interesting one is the on line number 9. It's a why method. What this one prints out is just code, and if you look at line number 1, that's what we have in the comment. So it actually prints. You can print it or inspect the comment before the class or a subroutine. I think it works on variables as well. And the comment is defined as just a comment symbol followed by a pipe. That's how you define that special type of comment.
So that's like Python docstring kind of.
I'm not sure. I don't use Python.
Can you do the same for methods?
Yeah. And I think everything. So this type of stuff, I couldn't find good documentation for it. Basically, you can modify methods. You can create your own types without writing code. I couldn't find any documentation. It's probably in the specs. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, check the specs. Perl 6 also has set, bags, mix types. They're really similar. The set is a collection of distinct objects. A bag is the same thing, but with integer weights. So each value inside of the bag could have a different kind of weight to it. And I'm going to show you an example. And mix is the same thing, except you get real weights, like not just integers, but any fractional number. And these ones are immutable. Once you create them, you can't change them. If you want mutable types, just use the hash variants. And here's an example of using it. Say if I want to count how many times a character appears in a string. We have a string. I'm using the comb method without any arguments. That gives me individual characters in a list. And then I'm using the bag method to convert that list into a bag. And when I print each key and value of that bag, I'm actually already getting all the counts, like for each character. There are also a bunch of set operators. In this example, I have a set of valid values, have an array with given values, and I want to check if all of those given values are actually valid values. So in this case, I'm using the set operator. It's a fancy Unicode. I don't remember the Texas variant. I think it's 3 characters. And with a single character, you're basically replacing possibly a grep and like 2 greps or 2 loops for this kind of operation. And another thing you can notice from broken syntax highlighting, I'm actually using fancy Unicode quotes. So basically, those are fancy Unicode quotes, and inside of that string, I have a different, another regular quote. And if you know how to type those characters, it might be useful when you're writing one-liners on your command line, because this way you don't have to escape them. Here are some more Unicode set operators, and there's a whole bunch of them. You can check the documentation. In this case, the first one just gives me singular values, so you see bar is not duplicated. And the second one, it just gives me all the values that are in one but not the other. And there's a whole bunch of them, these operators.
I'm sorry, the set's going to be composed of infinite lists, like if I want a set of all primes.
Right.
Can I manually define it and use the subset operator?
I think.
Should I think of it as something iterating through a list behind the scenes?
In this case?
Yeah.
No, it would be just a set of 3 or 4 objects.
So they
So
don't
fine,
work
it's
on,
finite.
it doesn't
Yeah.
work on generators or
I'm not sure what
things
it
that
is.
yield, well, something that yields a value as needed, as opposed to calculating everything all at once. Like the set of all primes.
Your first, the very first example you had
Yeah.
prime as a set, wasn't it? Or you just
No,
happened to
it
call
was
a
an
set?
array. I think, I never tried assigning it to a set, but
Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
I'm not sure. But another thing I want to mention, in this example, given is an array, and when I'm using the set operators, behind the scenes, it's actually get converted to a set, and that's an operation. And if you have lots of this type of conversion, your code might run slower, as opposed if you, like, the way you would optimize it is you would use a set from the start. Well, if you try to convert an infinite thing, well, I'm not sure what will happen if you try to convert the infinite. It might not do it.
I don't think it should work because it would be fairly trivial for the compiler to determine that it's a continuously increasing sequence. And by definition, I think that's continuously increasing. Should a sequence that's
Yeah,
continuously
but I think
increasing contains only distinct.
I don't think this is ordered, right? There's no first, second.
Right, but it doesn't need to be ordered, right? All the compiler needs to validate for something to be a set is that every single element there is distinct. And so for ranges, if the compiler can verify that the range is continuously increasing, then it can verify that every single thing there is distinct.
Right, but
They don't have to be.
the way that sequence
They
is,
don't have to be. Remember the Fibonacci, which was just start plus.
right, but I think you will run into a halting problem with that.
Random calculation, sometimes
Right.
dividing the number by 2 or sometimes increasing it.
Right. So, but for simple sequences like maybe even the Fibonacci, but for an increasingly for an increasing list of integers, if I can speak English, it should be fairly trivial for the compiler to determine the sequence. And once it can determine the sequence, it can validate the property required for a set.
Yeah, but how would you use that set?
Subset of examples.
As you can just check.
If it's something that's memoizable,
Yeah.
a pure function that results in a generator or whatever the equivalent. of
Yeah,
Perl
I'm not sure.
6 might be.
So as a rule of thumb, set should be smallish lists.
I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't go with small, I'd just go with.
Yeah,
defined.
just finite. Yeah.
Finite, yes.
So you can use other languages from Perl 6. I'm going to mention a couple of examples that are more than just, how you can start an interpreter or whatever. So you can use C libraries without writing any C code or compiling any C code, more or less. And you do that with a native call module. It's included in Perl 6. So by default, Perl doesn't have fork. And first of all, it's not needed as often as in Perl 5. And secondly, you can define it very easily. On line number 2, I'm creating a sub fork, and that's the name that will be looked up in the library. And I'm using isNative trait to specify that it should look in a C library. In this case, without any arguments to native, it will look at the standard C library. And you can see on line number 3, I'm actually calling fork, and I'm printing out the process ID. And from the output, you can see that it worked. Now, just a side note safety tip. You can't really see from the screenshot, but that's the Perl 6 eval bot on the IRC channel. And I tried to open the file, it wouldn't let me, but then I declared the system function from a C library. And that function lets you start executing a command. So even though it's restricted on the basic like running commands or open commands, native code is not restricted. So I was able to actually create files from that system.
And did they let you?
Yeah, they know that the problem exists. So here's a more concrete example. I kind of wanted to learn more about this, but I instead spent time playing video games. So I don't know much about this. If you know C, I think it will be easy for you to get a hang of it. On the first line, I think that's the way you would define a C struct. And on line number 2, I'm defining a subroutine from a SQLite library. As arguments, I'm passing out the struct I created, an int32 type. It returns a string. On line number 4, I'm passing an argument to native, the name of the library, and the version. And here's a map of types. You can find that in the documentation. On the left side is what you have in C, and on the right side, what you would use in Perl 6, like when you're writing the signature or the return value. And there's also a module called app.gp-trixie. It provides a script, and you can feed it a C header file. And it will generate all the code that you need to kind of link a C library to Perl 6. It's not perfect, but if you know C, I think it will be really easy for you to kind of finish off what the script started. And yeah, I wanted to mention something, but I forgot. Oh, not important. So you can also use any Perl 5 module using inline Perl 5. This module is not installed by default. You can get it from the ecosystem. And you can see from this example, I'm using Perl 5's Mojo DOM HTML parser. The way I'm including it is I added the from adverb, and I specify from Perl 5. And later in the code, I'm using it just as normal object. I'm calling methods like I would with Perl 6. And the output, you can see that it works.
How is it doing it anyway? How is inline doing it?
I think Perl 5 has some kind of C library, something like that. C.
Okay, so it's just feeding into that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in theory, it supports every module you can find in CPAN. In practice, I think a couple of people were complaining that a couple of modules were not working. I don't know if that's still the case. If you find something that doesn't work, report it as a bug. And you can also pass a bunch of types between the Perl 5 objects, Perl 5 subroutines, or Perl 6 objects. You can also call methods on Perl 5 objects, or vice versa. In your Perl 5 code that you include, you can refer to your Perl 6 objects. And you can even subclass Perl 5 classes into Perl 6. There's a whole bunch of different modules. You can use Python, Ruby, Scheme, Lua. You could try them out. I'm not sure how well they work. Now I'm going to talk about something really easy. Hacking an actual Perl 6 compiler. So now you might be surprised that I'm saying that it's easy, because if you want to work on Perl 5 compiler, you have to know C. Python, Ruby, you have to know C. Now, as crazy as it sounds, mostly all of Perl 6 is written in Perl 6. So what this means, if you're just a regular Perl 6 programmer, and you maybe don't know any other language, you can still help out with Perl 6. You can optimize it, fix bugs, add features. And so here's one example. And I know you can't see the code, but trust me, it's exactly the same. And on the left-hand side is a fix for a problem in a module. And the same problem existed in the compiler. And all I've done is I copied the code from that module into the compiler. And if it were bigger, if the font was bigger, you could see that it's entirely Perl 6, this specific code. Now, how is it possible that so much of it is written in Perl 6? There's a language called NQP. It stands for Not Quite Perl. That's the link if you need a documentation for it. And on the screen, you can see a random piece of code of the compiler. And the only bit, the highlighted bit, that's the only thing that uses NQP. And it's essentially kind of like using a module. Like you include a module, you call some methods on it. It's very similar to that. In this case, I think the NQP creates an object, and everything else is written in Perl 6. And if you want to check it out, that's the link over there, Rakudo compiler. That's the main compiler for it. And as I mentioned, yeah, the parsing is all done with Perl 6 grammar, and that's all Perl 6 code over there. So Perl 6 parses itself, and it's written in itself. I have some bonus slides. We have time, right?
8:26, we're good.
8:25. 35 minutes.
Okay, so I showed you how to do concurrent code. Because it runs on the side, kind of, if you have any error inside of it, you're not going to get it until you try to look it up. So in this example, on line number 2, I'm dividing by 0. That's an error. But if you look at the error message, it tells me it's on line number 8 when I look it up from await. So now imagine if that was like hundreds of lines of code, maybe a couple of modules. It would be really hard to find that error, the actual line number with that error. So the way you can do it, you can add, on line number 6, you can see I'm adding a catch block. And on the exception that it receives, I'm calling the backtrace method. So you can have that code as just a during debugging stage, or you can have it there permanently. And if you look at the output now, it includes the actual line number where the error was.
So the presence of a catch block implies that the try about everything above it is all errors above it.
Basically, if there's an exception kind of falling through that piece of code, it will get caught. Yeah, sorry.
The catch is implicitly in the code block.
The try is, yeah. The try is kind of the whole block, and the catch is just waiting for something to fall through.
There's lines 1 through 7 of the ones to which the catch applies.
Yeah, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah.
But to be ridiculous, I could have put the catch on top. And
If you
it's
put it on
semantically
top, it's not going to get caught.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of.
All right.
Perl 6 has a red type, and one interesting side effect of that is if you look on line number 1, I'm dividing by 0, and I'm storing the result in a variable. And on line number 3, I'm actually trying to find the sign of that value. So instead of crashing with an error that I'm trying to divide by 0, the program actually works. So the reason for that is a ret type. It's basically a number that has a numerator and denominator. And those numbers don't get computed until we actually need a number that's a result of that division. So that's why it doesn't die. Here on line number 3, I changed it from sign, just trying to print the value. This is the time when it will actually want to compute the value, and this time it dies. But it actually dies on line number 3, not where I did the division.
Why did not the first one? You have to still compute the
Because
the sign of.
the sign it actually has a special case where it checks for if it's a number. It's called isNaN method.
Thinking differently of spaces.
Hmm?
If you have 0 space slash space 0,
It will still work.
Oh, I could put any garbage. Meaning I could put x equal to a and call the sign on it.
Yeah, I guess. Basically, the division operator, when it has 2 numbers, it can compute a number that exists as a numerator and denominator.
Okay, so it's not
Rat's
a
a
math.
rational type.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's
Okay.
returning a rational type, and it doesn't actually do the computation that they ask it to do.
Okay, what if it was 1.1 divided by 0? Would that compare to floating point?
Would it
That's not
cause?
rational.
It would behave the same way.
Well, yeah, so it probably wouldn't.
It's still-
It's not rational, unless they made it work.
Well, that's my question. I didn't.
Yeah, like it doesn't use. Does not always use the numbers that you provide. It does some kind of calculation behind the scenes to figure out what's the best way to represent it. There's also proc async. That's a type that lets you use start a program, some kind of outside program. In this example, I'm calling grep. The first argument I give it is foo. It will look for that pattern. On line number 2, you see the method tab. That's a supply. We saw that from supplies. And in this case, I'm watching a standard output, and I'm just printing out what it gives me. On line number 5, I'm starting the process. It gives me a promise. And on line number 9, I wait the result of that promise when the program finishes. And the input that I sent to grep, lines 6, 7, and 8. And from the output, you can see that only one line got, that it returned only one line that had actually the pattern it was looking for. So this way you can asynchronously call the program. Now say function, if you use Perl 5, you might think that whenever you say something, it's just like printing with a new line with it. But in Perl 6, say is meant to print a little bit of output that's read by humans. And you can see a difference between say and put method. And put prints everything, and it also it's meant for reading like computers. And I'm not sure how to scroll this. Is there a way to scroll it to the left? Like to see the end of there. You see, the first example is actually stopped at 99, and that's how much it will print. But put will print everything. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to print some stuff out and you're using say instead of something else. Now here I mentioned the say equals gist method. And that method is defined for these types. Those are Perl types. But you can also define it on your own object. And in this case, I'm defining gist, string, and numeric. And when I'm trying to use my object, as I would use something like a native Perl type, it's actually calling those methods. So say method called gist, put method called str method. And when I try to use it as a number, it's called numeric. So this way you can make objects more useful. Perl 6 also has a built-in profiler. all you have to do is when you call your program, just add a profile flag, and it will generate an HTML file with the results.
Nice.
And that's one of the examples. And that's it.
Question about the learning this, trying to absorb the whole thing at once is
Don't.
a large
Yeah.
task.
I think the answer is don't.
It exceeds my stack depth quite considerably. So you've got to work out a path from the basic programming language up to Perl 6, you can tell what a language was designed to do. In the case of Perl 6, it's to solve the problems of language designers. But you've got to get there first. And looking at the documentation and the basic synopses and so on are essentially out of date. So looking at them is misinformation. We've got Jonathan's presentation, which is helpful. There's the Perl 6 tablets, some which is good, but I went to look up sub this afternoon and found it was just a stub there.
Yeah, they might be also out of date. I've seen somebody updating them a couple of months ago. I'm not sure how far they got.
So what can we do to boil down the information so that it's not too contradictory?
Right. Well, first, do you know the website perl6intro.com? Yeah, that might be a useful website. Personally, I find it most useful to go to IRC, that's a chat, and kind of just ask people, or if you have some code, you think there might be a better way. If you say, oh, hey, is there any way to make it better? And they kind of.
The trouble is, go to an IRC, you want to be able to produce a reasonably coherent question without sounding too much fun. I've already been chastised with main because I was trying to use it and got told that Perl 6 wasn't scripting. Well, I was trying to translate a script as being something simple, a bash script as being something simple to start off with.
In that case, have you tried out one of the modules? I think it's called Get Up or something.
I hadn't, but that wasn't the issue. There.
Oh.
The fact that
And you got chastised by asking you,
yes,
using the wrong terminology.
yeah.
You offended somebody.
It's like the first time you ask a question on Perlmux. That's always fun. I got accused
I
of
went through
being
a
evil.
writing exercise 2 weeks ago, and I found it pretty instructive to understand how parameter passing works, how parameters are passed to functions. And that's when I really started to like what Perl 6 had to offer. I was actually able to produce something that I found clean.
And it's clearly got multiple layers that you can start out with something. My initial target is the classes I taught where they start to look anxious when you introduce the modulus operator. And that's sort of the first level. And then you start getting into the more sophisticated levels. And about 5 down, there's the people who want to hack on the compiler because it's the language distribution. But getting through those steps, you've got to have the initial ones so that you're not thinking, okay, I've got a dot equal. What does that do? But the documentation, such as there is at the moment, tends to be contradictory and scattered.
Yeah.
Trying to pull it together is
Basically, the specification got finished last Christmas.
yeah.
And it's a huge language, so it takes a lot of time to update it and just write it.
But Christmas came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that the answer is Google is your friend and you can find anything you want provided you know how to ask for it,
Yeah.
you're looking for when is learning Perl 6 being written.
Well, I'm trying to write it.
Oh, so when will it be done so the rest of us can use it?
Another thing I can suggest is looking at the source of Perl 6. So maybe if you can get used to reading the code, you will see something that, okay, that's the way you might do it. because it's written in Perl 6.
But that's an
And-
awful lot of code that does a hell of a lot of things.
And you have to
it's
understand
all
Perl 6 in
organized.
order to be able to understand what the parser is telling it to do.
I gotta say, one thing I'm doing now with learning Ruby, and I'll be talking about this next month, is I'm doing the Ruby cones, which is by far, to this point in my life, the best way I have ever learned a language. There's cones out there for pretty much every language that I've seen, not Perl 6 yet, but it's a test-driven approach. You get all of these files, run. Your first test fails. There are 256 tests. Fix this first one and I'll get you to the next one. And it goes through every little element of the language, you know, the basic types, classes, methods, all that kind of thing. And I'm finding it an extremely, if you are already a programmer, it's an extremely efficient way of communicating information without a lot of the fluff if you don't want to read like, you know, learning Perl all over again. Like, yes, I understand programming, but so.
But cones as in pointy things? Cones as in pointy things?
Or is it one hand clapping?
Yeah. Yes to both. But
Cones?
it's K-O-A-N-S. It's like a Zen meditation.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
But I'd never heard of them before. And Ruby is one of the earlier ones, but literally you search on GitHub for koans and you'll find on the order of 263 different sets of them. So.
Just for Ruby?
No, that's for all different languages. So I've found that really good, and I think you should write something, Zoffix.
Yeah, I might.
Oh, there's a, just so you know, there's a bravo from Jim Keenan for you.
Thanks.
And there's Rosetta code. That there's a couple of problems there. One is that some of the Perl 6 which is there is now obsolete for one reason or another, so you can't rely on it. And I'm not sure that some of the things, well, some of the things that are on there are things that you might want to do. It's the way it's laid out. It's not terribly convenient. It's easy to compare the way to do a particular thing in several different languages, but there's a way to go through it. So there's a way to slice it the other way.
Actually, do you know a Perl user experience GitHub repository? Do you know anything about that?
No.
I don't know if you can use the browser.
Perl. Commando, yeah.
What is it, Commando?
Commando, yeah.
Okay.
This is one of the newer trackpads. I hate it.
Okay, so there's there's this repository. It's a github.com/perl6/user-experience. This entire repository basically exists to address the types of issues that you say. See, if you think that those Rosetta code examples are not really useful, there's something can be improved, you can create an issue over here and just make a suggestion of how it could be better. And here are some examples of issues that we have. Perl 6 needs a good REPL, and I think somebody actually worked on that. That's from January, and so that got improved. On the ecosystem website, you can't find the modules that are inside of distributions. Perl 6 man page, so that type of stuff. So if you have kind of, I guess the purpose of this is so people don't sit and complain, actually something that gets done. So that you can go in there and create an issue that you think. And the types, okay. The types of issues that he kind of addresses here is the entire user experience, from finding out how the Perl 6 is a thing, from installing it, from running it, developing it, getting help. I guess that's where your kind of issue will fall into. So yeah, you're invited by the Perl 6 community to address, to bring those problems forward.
All along you've been using the word ecosystem. Where is
Right.
CPAN for Perl 6?
Okay, currently, that is modules, Perl 6, perl6.org.
If you download Rakudo Star, yes,
Get a few modules.
yeah, and there's a Panda is the tool for getting more.
Okay.
If you go through it sort of in sequence, it is fairly straightforward. I've got a download the latest Rakudo Star script, which you're welcome to.
Yeah, I saw that in the list.
Of course, there's already Acme modules.
One thing I think is interesting with Perl 6 is how similar a lot of the new features are to Common-Lisp, almost like taken from Common-Lisp, right?
Yeah.
Gradual typing and multi-methods, rationals, doc strings, all these things were specified in the original Common-Lisp.
How did I know you'd bring up Lisp?
Well, if you've got a model that works and people are jealous of it, then why not steal it?
Yeah. So yeah, so this is modules perl6.org. You can see these modules. You would use you can use Panda and you would type one of these names. That's the current system, but eventually where currently you can upload your Perl 6 module to actual to CPAN or to PAWS, like Perl, whatever.
The regular pause?
Yeah,
They're
You
going to
can-
have Perl 5
you
and
can
Perl
do-
6 live alongside each other?
it's already happened. You can upload Perl 6 module right there, right now. But it's not going to show up on NetAccept CPAN for Perl 5. There will be Perl 6 version of that website. We're taking that website, making modifications for it to work for Perl 6. And eventually that will be like the final system. Because right now, all of this stuff is hosted on GitHub.
Will Meta CPAN 6 be written in Perl 6?
No, we're still in code from Perl 5.
Perl 6 was inline Perl 5.
So I noticed you had good syntax highlighting in your examples. Which editor were you?
I think I stole that presentation from Jonathan. It was one of his. I just copied it over and started writing my own slides.
Pretty sure there's syntax highlighting for Perl 6. There's an extension for Atom.
Yeah,
That does
that one was really good. And the guy who wrote it, he's a regular in Perl 6 IRC channel. So if you spot any problems, you can just report it. He gets them fixed almost right away.
And there's one for Web, so presumably there's one for Emacs as well.
I haven't found one that's quite doing it for Emacs yet.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. It's an operating system. So why would you write a syntax highlighter?
Do we have one from Vim?
For Perl 6, yeah. I think
I think so.
I'm not sure.
I'll bet
how
that was the
complete-
first one.
Yeah, it was the first one.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you for everyone who joined us online. I don't see you here, but I know there's a couple of you, so thank you. Have a good evening, and we'll see you all next month.